Welcome to everyone and thank you for attending. And first of all, thank you also to our speakers for this fourth seminar Tipping Point on Nutrition, Health, Culture and Evolution, Food for Thought. So we are really pleased to welcome Dr. Amanda Henry, Dr. Karen Metheny, Professor Nicole Bender and Professor Hanno Pijl. I will describe their profile quickly after. I welcome also the attendants to leave their camera open because it's quite disappointing to speak in front of dark screens. So it's nice to see people live on the Zoom mosaic. And also please turn off your microphone. And then each speaker will speak for 15 minutes. And then we will be interacting. And you can ask questions, and if you are shy, you can ask them in the chat. We will tell them loud. And whether in French or in English, we can translate them. There is no problem with language. So first, Dr. Amanda Henry will give her talk. She comes from Leiden University in the Netherlands. So Amanda is specialized in the use of microplants remains as marker of diet and especially with the use of plant food consumption in Neanderthal and early modern humans, as well as in our early ancestors, the Australopithecines. Dr. Karen Metheny is from Boston University, and she is an historical archaeologist and an anthropologist specialized in the archaeology of food. Professor Nicole Bender is from the University of Zurich, and she is specialized in evolutionary medicine, especially the evolution of human nutrition, chronic disease, and what we call mismatch disease. And last but not least, we have Professor Hanno Pijl from Leiden University. Hanno is a clinician, professor of diabetology, specialist of chronic disease, and interested in the evolutionary history of our nutrition to understand present-day disease. So the goal is to brainstorm together about the concept of food, which is really vital to us throughout our evolution. Food has been a matter of survival indeed. How can humans use their environment to access food and access food that allows and enable us to stay alive, to feed our big brain, and to withdraw as much as possible, as many nutrients as possible from the food item either we gather or we grow as agriculturists, or today that we buy in supermarket, and how the quality and quantity of food may affect our health, and how this can also affect our interaction within a culture or between cultures. So I leave the stage to Amanda. You're welcome to share your screen.
All right, thank you. That's a very nice introduction, Adeline, and I'm very happy to be invited here to talk today. Can you see my screen?
Yes, and we see your mouse as well, so it's wonderful.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to spend some time today talking about how our unique diet came to be and emphasizing some of the major milestones along the way. So present-day human diet around the world relies heavily on domesticated grains like wheat or maize, with a large component of meat and fat, and almost all of our foods today are cooked or processed. This contrasts quite sharply with what our closest living relatives eat. The great apes do not cook. The only food processing that they do is cracking nuts open. Most of their calories come from fruit and leaves and nuts. They do consume some animal protein, but most of that is from insects or very small game, things like monkeys or cat-sized deer. So the question is, how did we go from an ape-like animal living in tropical rainforests, relying on a small number of food resources, to a population of more than 7 billion that occupies almost every habitat on almost every continent? And I want to argue today that I think some of the unique aspects of our diet have enabled that change. And I'm going to describe some of the major milestones that have contributed to our success. First, I'm going to touch very briefly on how we study diet in the past. We use a combination of various techniques that all tell us some information about what a fossil species or an individual consumed. These include, for example, looking at the food remains themselves or the tools that they use to process the food. We can also study the shape of parts of the body to see what kind of foods could have been eaten. And finally, we can look at elements preserved in the bone mineral to see what broad categories of foods were consumed, with general differences between foods that came from forested environments versus those that came from open grassland environments. While none of these methods gives us the whole picture, the combination allows us to see general patterns and broad trends in diets. When looking at the evolution of human diets, we focus on the fossil species called hominins that are more closely related to us than to other living great apes. These are our ancestors and cousins. There are many different hominin species, some of which are illustrated on this graph. But this gives you an idea of the variety of species that have existed in the last 8 million years. And studying these can tell us about the evolution of our diet. So in this graph, the time span that each species existed is indicated by the height of the bar. And just to give you some context, Homo sapiens is up here on the top left, having been in existence only for about 200,000 years. So I'm going to start by discussing this group of fossil species, the oldest in the chart. There isn't much fossil material from this time period to study, but the general picture that we see in these species is that the skeletal and mineral signatures suggest that they were eating soft forest fruits, and that they spent a considerable amount of time in the trees. They have really long curved fingers and their arms are quite long compared to the legs. And among other things, this suggests to us that they followed a pattern very much like what we see with modern day chimpanzees. So in general, we can say that these earliest group of hominins had a chimpanzee-like diet. This next group of fossil species is where we start to see some changes. There are many, many more fossils to study, and so we have a better picture of what their diet was. Their body shape suggests they spent more time walking across open ground, and their teeth indicate harder foods. So this is a change from what we saw before. We also, at this time period, see the first possible evidence for making flaked stone tools and eating meat. So interestingly, what's special about this meat eating is that the animals that they were consuming are much larger than the ones targeted by chimpanzees. And based on the patterns of marks on the bones and how the bones were broken, we think they may have been focusing not on the meat itself, but on getting the fat-rich marrow inside those bones. But we don't know how much meat they ate or how often, and if they were actually active hunters or instead scavenging the kills of other large predators. So in summary, this group of hominins included harder foods in their diet, likely from non-forest habitats, so more maybe from open grasslands, and may have consumed more animal fats. Now, slightly more recently, in this period from about 2 to 3 million years ago, there's a big environmental shift in Africa, which caused some changes to our evolution and specifically to our dietary patterns. This was a period in which things dried out a lot, that the big rainforest regions shrank and the grasslands grew. What's interesting is that what we can see from the habitats that hominins seem to have preferred is that they like to have a mix. They like to be in places where there were some forested regions and some grassland, all within the same sort of daily occupation area. Also at this time, you have something of a split in our family tree. From this group in the middle, the gracile Australopiths, which I just talked about, you have one branch leading off to early Homo, which are the first members of our genus. And another branch leading off to what are called the robust Australopiths. Now, the main differences between these branches has to do with what they ate, which you can even see reflected in the shapes of their skulls. So the earlier gracile Australopiths, as I mentioned, they look somewhat ape-like, but their teeth show that they were eating quite hard foods. The robust australopiths seem to have taken this idea and really run with it. They grew very large skulls with huge, thick teeth and enormous chewing muscles, to the point that this was such a drastic change that the first robust australopith fossils that were discovered were actually nicknamed Nutcracker Man. In contrast, the species of early Homo seem to have gone in a different direction. They kept the large teeth of the gracile australopiths, but they grew smaller jaws, and this reflects probably a fundamentally different approach to food between these two branches of the family tree. Looking at the bone minerals of many individual fossils from this time period, we can also notice that there's some interesting patterns. Now, I don't want to get into too much detail on this chart, but the basic idea is that each different symbol represents a different species, and that individuals that fall sort of to the left of the chart ate food from more forested habitats, while those on the right ate more from more grassland habitats. And so the first thing I want you to notice is that there's a large variation both within and between species. So the species marked with the circles, the open circles and the closed circles, even though they're both robust australopiths, they completely don't overlap. Whereas the one indicated by the open squares, there's a huge amount of variability. Some individuals were eating almost exclusively forest resources, and some individuals were eating a lot of grassland resources. The second thing to note is that this open circle one is the one that was first published as the Nutcracker Man, and yet there's no evidence for consumption of forest nuts at all. In fact, perhaps we should call this Grass Eater Man. Also at this time period, we see an increase in evidence for tool use and meat consumption. But the same questions remain. We don't know how much meat was eaten, or how often it was consumed, or if this represents hunting and scavenging. But also at this problem, we have the additional issue that there were multiple different species all using the same landscapes at the same time period. And because the fossils and the stone tools aren't often found with each other, we actually don't know which of the many hominin species were actually the ones making and using tools. So to summarize, this time period represents hominins focusing really much more on non-forest foods, potentially more meat eating, and evidence for species-specific diets. So a wide range of different patterns at this time period. So now we move on to one of my favorite hominin species. This is Homo erectus. This species was enormously successful, surviving for more than 1 million years. And it was one of the first, it was the first species actually to move out of Africa. Now, in leaving Africa, Homo erectus faced a number of different challenges, and they would have had to learn about how to eat and what to eat in these new habitats. From their skeletal material, we also see that there was a small but noticeable increase in brain size and a probable similarly small but noticeable decrease in the size of the gut. All of these lines of evidence suggest that Homo erectus must have been eating different foods from the species that came before. But when we try to look explicitly at what was eaten, it's hard to say what this dietary change could have been. We do see that there is a change in the kinds of stone tools that they were using and making. They were regularly making these typical hand axes. We also see that there may have been a slightly bigger emphasis on hunting or consuming meat from very big animals, things like elephants and rhinoceroses. But all of our other lines of evidence, looking at the bone minerals, looking at other evidence for diet, it's really unclear. There's no consistent pattern that differentiates Homo erectus from the earlier species or that is consistent among all of the Homo erectus specimens that we have. Despite this inconclusive evidence, many people have nevertheless proposed a variety of theories for what made Homo erectus's diet different and what enabled them to survive for so long and move out of Africa. Some people have argued that the answer is more meat, that the consumption of these large elephants and stuff provided more meat. Other people have said no, it was starch-rich tubers or perhaps consumption of fish. And still others argue that cooking would have provided sort of the necessary calories and nutrients. In fact, any of these would have provided more calories or nutrients to feed this bigger brain in a wide variety of habitats. But unfortunately, there's actually very little direct evidence for any of these theories. And actually, my view is that Homo erectus was successful because it could be flexible, and that we should stop looking for that one key innovation that or food type that it defined Homo erectus diet, but instead consider that maybe they had a unique ability to eat a wide variety, or to survive and thrive on a wide variety of plants and animals, or combinations of food resources, and that this may have been supported by the new tool type that they developed, which allowed them to do a number of different tasks with one tool, like a Swiss Army knife. To summarize this time period then, this is the first species out of Africa that had a flexible diet, and it maybe included some or all of these new foods or technologies, but not consistently across space and time. Finally, I'll skip a little bit and focus on our own species. This is the first species for which we really have good, solid evidence for a much wider diet, one that included a wider variety of food resources. Humans had developed technologies that allowed them to capture and process new food types, and using a variety of new habitats, colder, higher, drier than we've seen before. Furthermore, this is the first time where we also see clear evidence for regional variation in diets, that populations in different regions focused on different food sources and macronutrient profiles and different combinations of foods, depending on what was available where they lived. Another major innovation that occurred quite recently in our history is the invention and spread of agriculture. Now, this is again a big shift, not only in the kinds of foods that we eat, but how we process it. Most of the foods that were first domesticated were chosen because they were easy to store. This makes them somewhat harder to digest unless they've undergone some intensive pre-processing. Such as illustrated here, you first have to grind it, then mix it with water, and then heat it. So agriculture then is some of the first evidence of really sophisticated multi-step food processing techniques. I want to quickly talk about food processing. It could be a whole talk on its own, but this is really one of the major components of our diet. And when it first occurred, and how it developed is still highly debated, because we have trouble seeing evidence of food processing in the archaeological record. Briefly, there's two main different kinds of food processing. There's non-thermal food processing, such as cutting, chopping, pounding, grinding. We know that this appeared probably very early. We have the stone tools that suggest it, and we also know that apes regularly engage in shelling or pounding activities. Thermal processing, or using fire to change the chemical and physical properties of our food, happened later, but when exactly is still really debated. Some people say it happened really early with Homo erectus, about 1 million years ago. Others argue that, if we look at the archaeological record, you don't actually see good evidence for fire until after 400,000 years ago, so quite recently. And as for the sort of multi-step, sophisticated food processing that I talked about in the context of agriculture, that may have happened earlier. We may have done things like boiling, or leaching, or grinding and then baking. But we don't actually have a way to see that in the archaeological record, because many of these technologies, the only thing that you need to do them is some sort of container. And unfortunately, early containers made of plant materials just don't survive. So it's not until the invention of pottery, which we can see in the archaeological record, that we have evidence for this processing. So to summarize then, Homo sapiens are characterized by a wider diet, with regional specializations and the use of multiple food processing techniques, as well as the invention of agriculture. Now, this is usually the point in the talk where somebody asks, but Amanda, what are we evolved to eat? Should we eat foods like this meal I took a picture of here, which follows a so-called paleo diet? Should we try to eat like our ancestors did? Is that the healthier way to eat? My question in response, though, is which ancestor do you want to eat like? Human diet has changed considerably over our evolutionary history. Even if you consider only our species, only Homo sapiens, dietary patterns have always varied considerably, both in the kinds of foods eaten, but also in things like the relative proportion of meat to plants or protein to carbohydrates ratio. And this is always dependent on the environments that people lived in, as well as cultural patterns laid on top of that. So I want to emphasize that there is no one single ancestral human diet. We've always been defined by having multiple different kinds of diets. I don't want to de-emphasize the link between our present day diet and our health, that the prevalence of non-communicable dietary related diseases such as heart disease and diabetes comprise a full third of the causes of death worldwide. So there is something to be said for being worried about what we eat. Personally, and I'm sure we'll get into this in some of the later talks, I think it doesn't have to do with an agricultural diet per se, so much as it does with an even more recent invention, and that is the degree of industrialization in our food systems and the processing that we change, that changes the underlying quality of our food. And hopefully the next speakers will tackle this issue. So to summarize then, there have been several dietary milestones in our evolutionary history. They range from adopting foods from a more open grassland environment, so moving out of a rainforest into a more open habitat and being exposed to different kinds of foods there, to an increased consumption of meat and fat, the development of the ability to survive on a wider variety of diets, to more recent inventions such as cooking and sophisticated food processing, and then even more recently, agricultural and industrialization. So with apologies for the very whirlwind tour of diet and human evolution, I'd like to thank the following people and you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for this really nice and inspiring talk. We can maybe spend 3 little minutes if there are questions or comments, and then we'll switch to Karen's talk. So Guillaume is raising his hand. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I just have one question regarding at the beginning where you had the isotopic data with the different species, and is it possible that the variability you have within one species could be due to having different groups living in different biomes and having slight different food procurement, or do you think it's completely for a completely different reason?
Just to clarify, you mean the variability within a species? Could that be due to different biomes? That is a possibility. I don't know enough, so that this is a chart from another paper, and I don't think they explored if there was an overlay between either time period, so age of the fossil, which is another potential confounding factor, or the exact site where that fossil came from. So that would be something I'd be interested in exploring, because at this time period, especially for, I think it was Africanus is the one that has that huge range of variation, whether it's just individuals making different choices or if there are other drivers of those dietary behaviors.
Thank you.
Another quick question, maybe?
Yes, thank you very much for this very nice presentation. I was just wondering, I know nothing about archaeological diets, but about Australopithecus africanus diet with the recent changes of the age attribution of this fossil, that is a little bit much older now, around 4 million years. Does it change something in the understanding of the diet? Is it different from before, or was there too much variability to say something?
Again, this sort of relates to my answer to the last question. I don't know of studies that have looked if there's changes within that species through time, for example. That is quite a long age range for one species. So I would expect, and this is sort of educated guess, that you would have environmental changes that may result in dietary changes. But I haven't seen any studies to that effect so far.
Thank you.
Okay, let's switch to Karen now. And if you have other questions, we'll have time after the talks. So Karen, feel free to share your screen. Perfect, thank you.
Got it. All right. Hello from Boston, where it's not quite 9 a.m. Thank you to our hosts for inviting me to participate in this seminar. I'm very honored to speak to you today on the topic of food in the context of tipping points in human development. I am by training an anthropologist and archaeologist, but I've been focused specifically on food and food practices for about 20 years while teaching and working as a food studies scholar. So what does that mean? Well, I've always considered the work that I do as a historical archaeologist and as an anthropologist to be multidisciplinary. As a food scholar, I've learned to approach the study of food and the complex relationships and diverse practices of humans in relation to food from an interdisciplinary perspective. And I've developed a more holistic approach to its study, borrowing freely, I will admit, theoretical concepts, methods, and data from many disciplines, including sociology, history, anthropology, gender studies, philosophy, economics, and material culture studies. But I also work with scholars from these disciplines in order to develop a broader perspective than that provided by a single discipline. I believe this has allowed me to move from the often very granular analyses of food remains in the archaeological record to larger questions about human action and motivation. So today then, as I discuss the role of food as a tipping point in human development, I am avoiding the term evolution, though it has been common since at least the time of V. Gordon Childe in the 1930s to think of food as integral to cultural evolution or development. In Childe's theory, as you probably remember, of the urban revolution, a food surplus is converted to a social surplus, allowing craft specialization and centralization. This leads to the formation of complex societies based on class or non-kin relations. We can go back further into the origins of a scientific archaeology in the 19th century to Christian Thompson and Jens Forsey to chart the development of cultural evolutionary schematas, as well as to the emerging disciplines of geology and biology, to see the growing influence of evolution as an explanatory model. In terms of food, it makes sense to hypothesize that shifts in subsistence, that is what is needed to live on a daily basis, if not actual diet, that is what is eaten, have led to broader cultural change. And it is understandable that in our search for explanation, we look for similarity in the human experience, developing generalizing models that we can test. Not surprisingly, we have also emphasized the relationship between food and human development in the context of environment, technological and material factors,
Karen, excuse me, your slides are not moving, so I'm wondering if we are still on your first slide. Is it normal?
Yeah, that's okay. Yep.
Okay, excuse me for interrupting.
Not a problem. So we have looked at environment, technological and material factors, as well as industrialization, climate change, the globalized movement of plants, animals, and disease, as well as the movement of people. But I think when we talk about food, we need to look past terms like evolution, which in a cultural sense, to me, implies determinism or a level of determinism. I want to encourage you to look as well beyond material, technological, and environmental factors to consider and engage with the variability of human culture. Here we go. Culture is messy, and it resists an orderly explanation. It often defies logic. And if culture is messy, then food choices and food practices are even harder to explain and categorize. We don't eat everything that we as humans might consume. Our food choices are not always rational. Culture, rather than biology, may be everything. Sometimes, as Levi-Strauss once said, food must be good to think, not just good to eat. So it makes sense to talk about cultural tipping points or cultural change and development instead of cultural evolution. Our choices, I believe, particularly when they come to food, are not predetermined. They may be structured by technological or environmental or material factors, but they are nonetheless frequently shaped by cultural preferences and practices, by food rules, by the communicative and symbolic power of food, even by individual experience. They are also shaped by cultural encounters with others. So again, everyone eats, but what we eat can be quite different. That's the question is why. When we look at key developments or changes in human history and prehistory in connection with food and food practices, we need to consider how human beings have acted to promote change, as well as how they have responded to changes thrust upon them. We need to consider how those actions and responses varied culturally. Rather than looking to neat categories of environmental, technological, or material change, we should be thinking also about the power of culture to shape and the spectrum of behaviors that can result, changes that are more truly reflective of a gradient. This is perhaps more easily seen if we draw on multiple disciplines. Archaeology can provide key data, of course, but anthropology, sociology, history, and gender studies, for example, may help us to articulate the reasons for such immense variation in food practices and the power of culture to influence human behaviors. So let's consider some of the tipping points in human development before considering the influence that culture has in driving change. A list of tipping points or innovations in human development might include many innovations connected to food, and I've listed a number here: tool use and tool manufacture. Tools, of course, are used for hunting and for cutting and chopping at a broad level, but there are also other types of food processing tools for grinding, pounding, grating, soaking, leaching, drying, heating, and fermenting. The invention of cooking, more on this in a minute, but it's worth noting that both tool use and manufacture and cooking itself potentially promote cognitive development through planning, through thinking about the future, as well as evolutionary change in a biological sense. Food storage. It has been argued that food storage is key to the development of complex society, but preserved foods are also a form of insurance against crop failure or other disasters, regardless of the patterns of subsistence a particular group is following. Amanda has mentioned domestication. It's important to note that there is no clear progression from foraging to husbandry to cultivation to domestication, and no inevitable forward progress. New practices were often abandoned. And we see considerable cultural variation as well as environmental and technological factors at work, influencing human choices of what to cultivate or domesticate. Pottery, or more broadly, material culture forms for food processing, preparation, and consumption. Daniel Miller, who's a material culture specialist, has talked about pots as one of the clearest examples of form seemingly meeting function, but a form that is often, or a function that is often overridden by art or design. That is, forms can become quite non-functional as we seek to make them attractive to look at or to develop art forms. And the last one I want to mention here is writing. It's interesting for me to note that the first recipes, so-called recipes, which are culinary tablets from Mesopotamia, as described by Jean Bottereau, These recipes emerge as lists of things. They are economic documents. They serve as mnemonic devices in many ways. But as Jack Goody and many others have argued, when information that was previously transmitted orally can be written down and stored, it can be analyzed in a different way. Formula, tables, graphs, representations that shift the way we think about food, but more significantly shape how we process information and then share that information. And we have only to consider changing forms of media, from manuscript books or recipe books, if we're talking about food, to print cookbooks, to a variety of digital forms on the internet, including online recipe collections, food blogs, food videos, and so forth. These inventions are undeniably important, and in the long term, they have considerable significance for human development. Clearly, the shift to agriculture led to cultural and societal change for many. We know that there were many independent centers of plant and animal domestication around the globe. And depending on whether you are a lumper or a splitter, you might argue for 7 centers, 11, 14, or perhaps more. Yet in each center of domestication, many different cultural practices have emerged, some based on differences in the specific plants and animals that were domesticated, but others arising from the development of cultural preferences for particular tastes and flavors, the use and availability of a particular technology, or the emergence of culturally specific practices involving those specific foods or the meal system itself. The evolutionary significance of the use of heat to prepare food has been argued for some time, as Amanda has noted. Increased digestibility leaves more calories for the brain or the body to use for other needs. But it's also important to draw our attention to the other benefits of food processing. The processing of raw ingredients can draw our attention, or they can result in a range of physical or chemical changes. They can help to reduce particle size, which is particularly important for members of a society or culture who are sick or infirm. Alteration of nutrients, detoxification of plants, so more raw materials can be made edible. We can expand our menu options. Processing also helps to remove what is indigestible or considered undesirable to consume. It increases absorption of nutrients, and it helps to reduce processing time. So these are all important factors to consider as well. Now, earlier this month, archaeologists reported what they believe is the earliest confirmed evidence of controlled cooking by hominins, dating to 780,000 BP. This is the site of Gesher Beinot Yaakov in Israel. For my sanity and yours, I'm just going to call it GBY, which is the accepted acronym here. The site is located in the Jordan Rift Valley in Israel. It dates to the early Middle Pleistocene. It's considered to be, therefore, Acheulean, and it contained significant remains of fish, some in association with cultural deposits. The archaeologists have worked very hard to distinguish naturally occurring deposits from cultural, what they believe to be cultural deposits in terms of these fish. They have drawn on different types of evidence, including X-ray powder diffraction analysis to measure crystal sizes in tooth enamels, and these change when teeth are exposed to fire. They've conducted experiments, what we would call a form of experimental archaeology as well. And with all of these different types of evidence, they have concluded that these fish were, quote, exposed to temperatures suitable for cooking and were not simply burned in a spontaneous fire. The authors also speculate that baking may have taken place using an earthen oven, which you see in this illustration on the left. But it's important to point out that there is no direct evidence for this practice. But it does lead us to another key point. Often, without realizing the nutritional significance of our actions, groups develop specific cultural practices and preferences in terms of how they process and consume their chosen foods. Cooking is a cultural behavior. Only humans cook. If it weren't culturally influenced, humans wouldn't have developed so many methods for heating foods. Consider that cooking not only improves the taste and flavor of food, but can also enhance its perceived value in a variety of social and cultural settings. We can see this today and historically in the development of local, regional, ethnic, and national cuisines, but also in the development of creolized, hybridized, and globalized cuisines. Archaeologically, we are beginning to identify evidence for different food processing and cooking methods. For example, the evidence for steaming foods in an underground earthen oven using clay cooking balls at the site of Escalera al Cielo. This is a terminal classic period Puc Maya site located in the Yucatan in Mexico, dating to AD 800 to 950. Similar examples have been recovered from Çatalhöyük, a Neolithic site in Anatolia dated to 7,300 to 6,000 calibrated BC, but also the late archaic site of Poverty Point, a World Heritage Site in Louisiana in the United States, dating from 1700 to 1100 BC. Residue analysis confirms the use of both clay balls and stones for cooking at a range of archaeological sites. There is also considerable variation in the construction of earth ovens, forms of stone griddles, the use of hot rock cookery, the construction of steaming pits, as Alston Toms has documented, as well as choices of whether to use direct or indirect heat, how long to steam, to roast, or to bake, and choice of materials, for example, seaweeds that are used in clam bakes to help retain moisture and to insulate against the loss of heat. So again, there's considerable variation in the process of cooking, one that we have, a process that we've argued is a tipping point for human development, but you can't ignore these variations. They cannot be attributed solely to material forms, to environment and technology. We need to consider cultural preferences. While archaeologists and scientists have posited that lactase persistence developed in tandem with the rise of pastoralism, Richard Evershed et al. Report a more complex history. In this recently released report, they share the fact that they've used dairy fat residue analysis on pottery sherds as a proxy for milk use, and they report widespread milk consumption with the arrival of pastoralism in Europe approximately 9,000 years ago. Yet ancient DNA shows Neolithic populations in Europe did not develop a gene for lactase persistence until much later under selective pressures of famine and plague. So for thousands of years then, people seemingly made the choice to consume dairy even though they experienced gastric distress as a result. It is worth noting that other Neolithic populations and even contemporary cultures with lactose intolerance have developed alternate forms of consuming dairy through fermented forms such as yogurt or kefir or cheese. And then I want to briefly mention the importance of fermentation, also described as a tipping point, I would think. Fermentation is defined as the chemical reduction of complex substances. Fermentation serves to enhance flavor, improve digestibility, and increase the nutritional value of foods. But it was particularly important for preserving foods and detoxifying plants, particularly in tropical environments. In some cultures, fermentation has served as a primary source of calories through fermented foods and beverages. So it's been key to subsistence, key to diet. Fermentation is, of course, important in the making of bread in some cultures. It is also unnecessary, I hope, to point out the importance of fermentation to making beer and wine. and it's important to point out that you can make fermented beverages from almost any plant. So fermentation is the key to the production of many different kinds of beverages in a range of cultures. Again, the tremendous variability in what is fermented, how it is consumed, and its importance to foodways suggests that culture has a powerful influence. With these few examples, I hope I've shown that it's impossible to study food as a tipping point in human development without understanding the powerful influence of culture. Scholars use the term foodways to acknowledge that food and food-related practices exist within cultural systems, and to think about food in a way that encompasses the cultural aspects of food, human values that range from food rules, that is, what we eat, with whom, and how we eat, to the communicative and symbolic meanings of specific foods and beverages, or the places and methods of their preparation and consumption. It's important to emphasize that foodways are dynamic, another reason for the tremendous variation in food practices. Food and foodways change for many different reasons: economic necessity, environmental change, shifts in technology and infrastructure, health, warfare, politics, family and work dynamics, religious beliefs, life cycle events, even fads. But shifts in foodways also reflect the movement of people, goods, plants, and animals. They reflect cultural contact, both direct and indirect. Foodways are subject to both long-term and short-term change as a result of cultural encounters, as new plants and animals are introduced, as new processing and cooking technologies are made available, as new ideas about food are observed. The alterations made while assembling, combining, recombining, and transforming foods and foodways in the course of cultural encounter and exchange can represent, encode, and even engender social and cultural processes of change. Foodways or a foodways lens can help us to identify larger cultural shifts through adaptation and accommodation, but also the imposition of new cultural regimes, disruption to traditional practices, separation among groups, negotiation of identity, and resistance to marginalization. So a food lens helps us to understand that culture, including contacts with other groups and their ideas, whether it's through colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, industrialization, or globalization, can be the basis for profound cultural and social change. So yes, technology, yes, material considerations, yes, environment, yes, biology, but it is also the variation in our food practices that tell us that human development has been repeatedly shaped by cultural factors, often in unexpected and deeply meaningful ways. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen, for this very enlightening talk. It's really amazing how broad is the scope of your talk, and you could really give us insight into culture, the way we perceive food. For one question before we switch to the talk by Nicole. No question? No? Okay, maybe for later. Then please, Nicole, feel free to share your screen. And please turn on your microphone as well.
So, can you see and hear me?
Perfect. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I am from the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine in Zurich. And I will make a slight shift now from the history of diet and the culture of food, as we nicely heard until now, to the outcomes of health actually in humans, and how did it come. So, and I will heavily rely on what was said until now, and I'm very, very happy we had this nice introduction. introductions about the evolution of diets and the cultures of food. This will, of course, help me to stay a little bit shorter in my presentation. So I have to see how I can advance here. So I will especially talk about obesity and also related diseases like diabetes and heart diseases and so on, which are directly linked to diet, especially today. So normally, if you hear about factors which may cause obesity in the medical literature, you hear that it's a multifactorial disease. So there are many, many causes from genetics, environmental, behavioral, social, and so on. So many, many factors being responsible for the obesity epidemic that we are facing right now. But these factors are not sufficient to explain this obesity epidemic. So people realized, especially biologically trained people, that there might be also evolutionary explanations behind it, especially because of these strong genetic factors. I'm searching my mouse, yeah. And many, many people were thinking about evolutionary causes. Since the 60s, since the thrifty gene hypothesis by Neil, we are thinking about which evolutionary explanations might be behind is this propensity of humans to develop obesity, but also to develop diabetes type 2 and so on. There must be some kind of explanations, and I don't want to go through this table now. Of course, this is just to show how many people were thinking about this, and I want to show you some of the important points that I think are important to relate to these diseases, and especially what this has to do with the evolution of diet in humans. We have to ask ourselves is what is actually a normal weight for humans. Many different cultures, populations worldwide. So if I look a little bit at different populations on the planet, on different regions, especially in the non-industrial societies worldwide, what mean BMI they show, we see that mostly the BMI, so the body mass index, is between 20-25 roughly. So this is people that are not influenced by modern diets and do not suffer from obesity and related diseases. And they show this BMI. And interestingly, a BMI between 20-25 is what here in the Western cultures we relate to the best health and the best longevity. So this is probably not by coincidence. This BMI seems to be, for some reason, healthy and also common to humans, to normal weight humans. And now let's look a little bit deeper in this, because BMI, what is BMI? BMI is weight per square meters of height. So weight can be whatever. Weight can be muscles, weight can be fat. So we have to look a little bit more into details regarding this weight. So let's look a little bit more in the body composition of modern humans. Here, this graph shows number of adipocytes, so fat cells of a species per body mass. And these circles, these are all different species. So my mouse. And we are here, we are the humans. So these are regression lines that you see for the different species. And so the more up from the lines you are, the more fat cells you have per body weight. And we are rather high up here as humans. This means we have more fat cells per body mass than expected. And so comparable with us is only this HH. This is the hedgehog. This is a small hibernator that needs this fat to survive the winter. And comparable to us is up here in the right upper corner. These are the whales that live in cold water. All other species have actually less adipocytes per weight. This is extraordinary. It means this is a feature from us humans, because these are number of adipocytes. They can be also empty. This has nothing to do with overweight. This is a human feature, and this needs an evolutionary explanation. We are also born fat. This is a percentage body fat of neonates. So these are that did not eat and did not drink anything yet. And we see that the humans are among the neonates with most body fat percentage among these mammal species. So again, to explain this, several explanations around before, also like regarding diet, also regarding body composition. There are different explanations like adaptations to different environments, cold environment, aquatic environment, or the most popular at the moment is that the fat reserves are important for the big brain and the brain development in the. So why do I stress this so much? Because we have, if we talk about overweight in modern humans, we have to differentiate two aspects. On the one hand, as a species, we have a lot of fat tissue. Also, if we are slim people have a lot of fat tissue compared to other primates. And this feature needs an evolutionary explanation. And on the other hand, there are people today in the modern environment who accumulate too much fat and are prone to diseases like heart diseases or diabetes. And this is then a pathology. So these are two different things that need to be distinguished. And I see in the literature that sometimes the 2 points are a little bit confused. So people try to explain why we have the propensity for obesity, why we have the propensity for diabetes. And then the explanations go in this first point. They start to talk about why we have fat at all. But in my opinion, we have to keep this differentiation because we are not talking about the same thing. And the second point in the evolutionary medicine literature is explained by this mismatch, this famous mismatch hypothesis, that we have still our genome that is more adapted to a natural environment, to natural food, and a lot of physical activity. And we are not adapted to this fast changing environment, this man-made environment, which is coined by high processed food, high caloric food, and low physical activity. And this mismatch then leads to obesity and disease. So what I'm pointing a little bit are we are talking about tipping points here, and regarding food and regarding also maybe body composition. The tipping points that normally we speak about is the Neolithic revolution with the coming up of agriculture. The industrial revolution is important, where we started to really change also our food production. But maybe, as we will see later, we have also maybe even more recent points that we should stress at, and I will discuss this later on in my talk. Why? If we look at the curve of obesity rates, really more recent. This is now the numbers for the US. We don't have them much back in time at a yearly rate, but if you look at the numbers from the 60s, overweight did not change that much, but obesity started to rocket from the late 70s, 80s onwards, and they are still increasing. This is as it looks like right now. And here are the numbers from Switzerland. This is own work. These are numbers, but this is not the whole population. This is only Swiss conscripts. So these are young males from the military. But here we have numbers more back in time. And we see the jump. This is now body mass index. Here's my mouse. We have a few numbers back in time, before the Industrial Revolution and afterwards. And this This jump is also in height, body height, of course, but also BMI. Here we see that something happened, and then it was rather stable for a while. And then we have a little bit messy data, but a clear, rather steep increase from us again, from the late 70s, 80s onwards, like in the US. But the BMI in general, so not, this is now together, it's not just overweight or obese people, but the BMI of the whole population went up rather steep. Here in Switzerland, we now have a plateauing of the numbers. It's not going up steep anymore. But we observed the same rather steep increase in the same period like in the US. Something must have happened, and because all age groups are involved and both sexes are involved, and it seems that something in the environment changed that affected everybody, the whole population. It seems to be in different countries, at least in the Western countries, and it's probably not genetic because the time frame is very, very short. So here we have, it's not known what happened exactly. Many, many factors are discussed, and I will look at this a little bit more deeper right now. So this is now a point that we heard in the first talk a little bit, the very modern impact of sugar or carbs, but also, of course, portion size increased, the fast food expanded a lot. So fast food is also a different kind of fats and not just the carbs themselves. So a different composition of the food, which changed in the last decades and which came more and more in industrialized countries, is hand in hand with this change in body composition in the population. This is now a graph from the US, but very similar. It's probably also for European countries and other westernized countries. This graph here is for Switzerland again. This is own work again. Here, I don't explain the whole study because of time's sake, but what we did here, we took a Swiss population, only overweight people. So we characterized only overweight people, and we looked with a cluster analysis what type of social demographic characteristics do overweight people have in Switzerland. And we found more or less 4 clusters, very different people. So there is not the overweight person in Switzerland, but we found young people living at home. We found highly educated men. We found women living alone, and so on. So very, very different people, all with overweight, all living in this highly high income country of Switzerland. And we looked in these different clusters, how do people eat? This is in this chart. This is how much do they rely with healthy eating index, the AHI. This is the alternate healthy eating index. And for the different categories, we changed them so a little bit. So the red means always not healthy, and green always means healthy. So you can see the different clusters. These are very different in these terms, how they eat. So the young people living at home, they really eat unhealthy. So if you want to go for a prevention project, you should go for them. But other kind of overweight people, they do not eat so unhealthy, actually, according to what they say and what they report themselves. Only this highly educated man, maybe they eat a little bit too much meat. But just to show you, there is not, as we heard also for whole populations worldwide and whole adaptations worldwide, even within small populations like overweight people in Switzerland, even within so small populations, you find this strong variety. Very similar is the story if you look at physical activity, because of course, if you look at overweight and diseases, you also, it's not just nutrition, you also have to look at physical activity. And again, the theory says we adapted to move, adapted especially for long duration activities, And if you go now, we change to a sedentary behavior, and this is leading us to overweight and obesity. So if you look at different populations worldwide again, we see similar patterns like for diet, that there is not the one kind of physical activity. Hunter-gatherers, they move actually a few hours per day. And pre-technology farmers, they move many hours per day. But if you look at the energy spent per day, now the hunter-gatherers in white, they are the ones who spend the most energy per day. And the farmers comes second. And we, the westernized, we are the black ones. We are the ones who spend less energy. So this is not so surprising, but we also spend not that much less energy. So I'm rather surprised that we do not spend much less energy. So the physical activity alone is not sufficient to explain this huge obesity pandemic that we are experiencing right now. It must be a combination of factors. Let's go a little bit more in detail now for one of the nutritional aspects, and I chose meat. Why meat? Because similarly as we heard before in the talk before, we are asked sometimes how should we eat, especially this paleo diet. I am also asked several times, should we eat like ancestors? Should we go for the paleo diet? I always have to answer this question, and now I want to go for a little bit in this question a bit more. So yeah, how much meat shall we eat? So this question has several answers. First, if you look worldwide again, different societies, non-industrial societies, variation is big. As we heard now several times, there is not the one picture. Depending where you live in this world, depending on regional cultures or also regional ecosystems, it's very, very different how much animal and how much plant food people eat. So there's not one answer for there. Second, the meat that we eat today, this is not from these domesticated animals that are grain-fed. This is not the same composition of meat, especially the fats that this meat contains is not the same like wild game. So even if we want to live like hunter-gatherers and we eat a lot of meat, we will not have the same fat composition and meat composition like if you would eat a wild game. Especially this the content of monosaturated and polysaturated fats. If you compare with the gray bars, the wild game fat composition is very different. So no way to eat like our ancestor in this way. Another point that is very, very important today, probably leading to many answers about health, is processed, highly processed foods. Here is the picture for processed meat. This is a very recent review comparing processed meat to neurodegenerative cognitive impairment. Very similar pictures we have also for cancers, that for most meats, the curves are rather flat. Even for red meat, it's not so clear, but processed meat seems to be detrimental. Detrimental for neurodegenerative diseases, detrimental for colorectal cancers, and so on. Processed foods seem to be have a very negative impact on health, and I think in the future we will hear much more about these, and I hope there will also be some actions in the future. And this, we should take into account into modern cultural changes. I'm searching for my mouse here. So, and a third aspect about meat consumption, it's not just about us, it's not just about health. We also have to keep an eye on the planet. We are eating our planet. We have really to take care. And if you look a little bit about ecology, about ethics also, we should reduce our meat consumption anyway. So we don't have to go all for a vegan diet or vegetarian diet. There are some problems also there. But just to mention, probably the answer for the future will be in any case to reduce the animal-based foods in any case, whatever we do for the health, but also for the planet. Some points that I just mentioned, I will not go in detail, that, or if you look at food and health, that maybe the discussion will come up, is also the influence of the microbiome. We heard a little bit about lactose intolerance, and I remember that I read also some papers that one of the aspects that also involved there is microbiome, and microbiome is very, very sensitive to changes in diet, and more it's discovered that it also has a strong influence on health, not just on gut health, but also on many aspects of health you would not expect, like cardiovascular diseases, even mental health. So it's we know that it is even across species, it can be very, very sensitive to changes. So here you see a study on the similarity of microbiomes across species. The red, these are westernized humans, and the yellow, these are humans living more under natural conditions. And the other ones, these are primates, and the brown ones are primates living with humans. And so these primates, the microbiome of these primates approached more the human microbiome composition than the other primates living in wild environments. So the microbiome is very, very sensitive to changes. And so this is what we have to consider also when we look at diet and health. Another factor that is also in very much studied right now is epigenetics, the influence between nutrition and epigenetic influences, especially during pregnancy and early childhood, and health outcomes later in life. But here I will not go in much into details, just to mention this is also under study right now in evolutionary medicine. Yeah. So what are the future trends? I think we have to go much more about evolutionary explanation. If you go into prevention of diseases, take a life course approach, go much more for personalized nutrition and not for the one-fits-all recommendation as we have right now. Sustainable food sources we have to look at if you want to have a planet also in the future. And microbiome and epigenetics is a topic that we will also have to look at the future. With this, I want to thank you for listening, and who is interested, this is our webpage of the Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Shall we take one question before the talk by Hanno? I see a lot of bravo, no hands raised for questions. Speak up if you have any. No? Okay, let's go for the last talk, and if we have questions, we have time after. So Hanno, you're welcome to share your screen. Perfect, thank you very much. And please turn on your microphone.
Here we go. Now you can hear me, right?
Perfect, thank you.
Yes. So, hi everyone. And now from a bit of a different angle, I would like to, first of all, I would like to thank all the previous speakers for very informative and stimulating presentations. So this last presentation will try to explain, I will try to give my view on how this terrible pandemic of chronic non-communicable disease came over our planet. you all know that there is a huge pandemic of chronic disease in the Netherlands. In fact, almost half of the population has at least one chronic disorder. It's really amazing. And the question is that I'm going to try to explain is how did we get into this mess? And I think the story starts a couple of million years ago when our ancestors, and you all know that, lived in Africa, and their diet was actually determined by the place they lived, and they lived in the woods, in the forests, and they primarily, Amanda told you this already, they primarily consumed fruits, plants, and nuts, basically complex carbohydrates, very difficult, often very difficult to digest, fiber-rich carbohydrates. And from that time, and I need to see how to further my slides. Oh, there we go. From that time stems this beautiful physiological system that is meant to store any excess of those carbohydrates they found in those days. And I briefly have to explain because it is really important for understanding of the current pandemic. So when we eat carbohydrates, they are digested by the gut, and then basically glucose enters the blood circulation, and glucose then circulates along all kinds of tissues, among which is the pancreas, and the pancreas starts producing insulin. And insulin is critical for disposal of the glucose into several tissues. So for removing glucose out of the circulation towards muscle and liver, for example. So, and then approximately 2 million years ago, the brain of our ancestors started to grow. And this is what I call the first tipping point. First of all, because it made us more intelligent. And our intelligence actually ultimately brought us to where we are today. Our intelligence plays a big role in the pandemic of chronic disease, I believe. So, but more things, and the reason why our brains start to grow, there's lots of discussion about that. I think it has been facilitated by a change of diet, which I will not go into, but it's a fact that our brain started growing, and it made us more intelligent, but more happened. Our preference for sweet foods was actually reinforced. So chimps have also a preference for sweet, but humans became even more, they targeted sweet foods even more, I believe. And there's a reason for that. You have to realize that our brain is very expensive in terms of energy expenditure. And it's much more expensive, in fact, than a chimp's brain that uses about 8% of total energy consumption for brain activity, and humans use 25% of total energy expenditure for their brain. So the brain is very expensive in terms of energy expenditure, and it is critical to know that the main fuel of our brain is glucose. And so all other tissues in our body can combust fatty acids as well. The brain cannot do that. So the brain relies on glucose as its primary fuel. So this is the reason why we developed this strong preference for sweet foods, because sweet stands for sugar, and sugar is nothing more or less than short, very easily digestible change of glucose molecules. So sugar provides us with critical energy for our big brain. And even more happened because this system that we just talked about changed. in the years after we got this big brain. What happened is that we became, that insulin became less effective. And this was very advantageous because by insulin not working so well, the glucose did not get into muscle or liver tissue, but instead it remained available for brain cells to use it as a fuel, because brain cells do not need insulin for glucose entry. So because of this metabolic change, which was completely dedicated, was completely meant to provide glucose as a fuel for brain cells, in particular in times of food scarcity, we humans had that brought a survival advantage for humans. Now, another, I think, deeply ingrained biologically driven behavior is sitting. Yes, sitting was essential. As soon as we had enough food, we had to sit to spare energy, in particular for this big brain to keep on being provided with enough fuel. And I will argue that these habits that have developed in big part because of our brain growth now actually turn against us. Because what happened next, and this is the next tipping point, I believe, is agriculture. And you all know this happened about 10,000 years ago in several areas in the world. And what did we do as humans? We started growing crops. And these crops primarily comprise starch, starchy crops, and 70% of all the calories that were consumed by farmers after the advent of agriculture was from the land they cultivated. So 70% was from starch-rich crops. And now there is very little evidence of biological benefits of agriculture. In fact, agriculture primarily had social benefits, and one of the main issues, one of the main things that agriculture brought was technology. And well, I know there's discussion about why there was an explosion of technology since the advent of agriculture, but I personally believe that it was primarily because only part of the population took care of food for the rest. And this is almost unthinkable among hunter-gatherers, among their ancestors. So part of the population was free to think about other things, including technology, including social and political organization. So that explains, in my view, the success of agriculture, which spread, of course, in no time over the rest of the world. So, and this technological explosion culminated in the Industrial Revolution. And this is the real tipping point that brought us where we are today, I think. Because what happened with the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Revolution actually gave us the technology to maximally satisfy our biological instincts, our biological drives. You know, one thing we started doing was we started basically constructing our own food. We, and in particular, over the last 50, 60 years, we shifted away from natural food to the food that we construct ourselves. And we know now that processed food, that this constructed food items are very bad for us. It has been said by Nicole and by, I think, also by Amanda. So this is really one of the main drivers of the pandemic. We know better and better. There's more and more literature about that. And for example, what we do is we put in that food sugar because we like it so much. And this slide shows the number of kilograms of sugar per person per year in the UK as from the start of the Industrial Revolution to 200 some years ago until now. And it rose from 7 to 70 kilograms of sugar per person on average per year in the UK. I mean, we eat crazy amounts of sugar, and there's more to processed food that is bad for us. For example, the wrong fats are in there. They're used for processing. They're emulgators. There's too much salt. We like salt as well because salt is very rare in natural food items, and so we put it in our food, and it damages us, damages our health. But in particular, those sugars and the starchy products that are that form that are staple since the agricultural revolution in our diet, and as long as we keep these food items, keep eating these food items in the context of that metabolic adaptation that I just described, where insulin doesn't work as well as it should, because, you know, to keep glucose available in the circulation as a fuel for the brain, what happens if you keep on eating starch, which is nothing more or less than long chains of glucose molecules, it's a kind of sugar. So what happens is that glucose levels increase in our bloodstream and insulin levels increase in our bloodstream because glucose is the primary trigger for insulin release. And we know now that high glucose levels and high insulin levels are drivers of inflammation. They inflame us. They cause a kind of chronic low-grade inflammation, just like the wrong fats that are in the food, the emulgators that are in our processed food. So I'll come back to this in a second. But the other thing we do is we developed a technology to bring us everywhere in a motorized way. So we don't have to move for anything anymore because this is a biologically driven behavior. And now what do we know? Oh, I'm sorry. Last point. We smoke and we use alcohol. And this behavior is promoted by very, very powerful reward systems in our brain that are meant for food, actually. But smoking and alcohol have effects on similar mechanisms in the brain. And so this behavior is also driven by evolutionary conserved mechanisms in our body. So now what do we know about the cause of all these non-communicable diseases, or at least many of them? Well, the aging process is involved. I'm not going into the details there, but aging is certainly not the only factor. I don't think it's the most important factor. There's at least 7 components of our way of life that drive these non-communicable disorders. From upper left against the clock, counterclockwise. So chronic stress, we move way too little. We are meant to move a big part of the day. We smoke. We sleep too little and often of bad quality. We use alcohol. there's toxins everywhere around us. We breathe them in. They enter with our food or through our skin, and then finally we eat way too much of the wrong foodstuff. And then I always say, many of us, almost all of us, actually do this. Almost no one lives a truly healthy life in our society, and yet not everyone gets sick, and we certainly do not get the same disease. So this is because all these factors interact with our genome and our microbiome. This is what Nicole also stressed. The microbiome appears to be very, very important in the genesis, in the development of chronic disease. And as you can see, there is various evolutionary driven behaviors in here. The lack of exercise, smoking, alcohol, and we eat too much of the wrong food items because we like them so much, because we like sugar, we like calories, we like fats, because, you know, in the early days when we found fats, we needed to eat them to get enough energy. And now we have this technology to construct our own food that has all these elements in it. And then all these factors cause this chronic disease because they cause what we call systemic chronic inflammation. So on the left side of this slide, you see the lifestyle factors that we just talked about. And then there is, in the middle, there's this systemic chronic inflammation wheel. And then on the right side are a wide variety of non-communicable disorders that are actually caused by evolutionary driven behavior. So this is what this is my view and what I wanted to share with you on how we ended up in this mess of non-communicable disorders. We evolved really as physically active organisms, eating primarily plant foods, and later on fish and meat in moderation. And then these agricultural and industrial revolutions came about, largely because I'm sure that because we got more intelligent. And these revolutions, which are two tipping points, I believe, changed our diet and lifestyle fundamentally. And it basically provided us with the technology to maximally satisfy our biological instincts. And these biological instincts now turn against us. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hanno, and bon appétit. So it seems that basically our intelligence is being challenged now to be quite sensitive and make the good choice to preserve our health and not get extinct really fast if we continue on that way. So
yes.
Do we have questions for Hanno or specifically, and then we switch to general discussion? Any specific questions?
I got a question. It's Solange.
Yeah.
So I think it's a general question, and many of our guests may answer, but I have the feeling that we observed in our modern society a kind of shift, because the behavior behind the food acquisition, food production, food consumption that are documented for our past communities seems to be quite collective behavior. But in our modern society, for the past years, we observe that finally individualities are expressed through what we are eating. We observe that in excavation for the past 5 years, every single excavator has a specific diet. No gluten, no milk, no blah blah, and everybody is expressing, and it's not, and most of the time it's not really, I mean, it's expressed for medical conditions, but in fact, if you discuss deeply, it's more individual choices to adapt for many reasons their food, and they express their individualities in collective environments. So I guess we are really observing a switch to our relation on how we consume and we eat and we produce food in like for the recent time. And I wonder how what could be the consequence, and if it has been observed in other contexts of the world, because I'm speaking from my European Occidental point of view, and if it was maybe observed in a historical time or recent past time.
Maybe I can try to
Yes.
because I think it's an interesting observation, and you're very right. There's all kinds of, everybody has its own opinion about food and about what is healthy, or and there, I think there's different arguments used by people to choose for a certain type of dietary behavior, and it's an interesting observation. I'm not sure whether this has been there before. I really don't know. I think it in the past. I don't think that the choice was so big as now. There in 100 years ago, eating was quite simple. You ate what came from agriculture, and there was much less choice, because the food industry didn't produce. You have to realize that the food industry every year produces about 20,000 more food items and brings it to our market. We have a huge choice of food now, and this is unique in human history, I'm sure. So I guess in the past it didn't happen as clearly as it does now. And if you ask me, the main, I'm not sure whether what I am sure about is that we need to personalize food choice, to really personalize food choice to reach optimal health. There's more and more scientific evidence for that. Everybody reacts differently in a biological way and in a mental way, even to different to food items. So, but I think this is an area of research that needs to develop still. We need to know much more before we can personalize dietary advice. For now, my main message to my patients is stay away from processed food. Stay away from food that is basically constructed by the industry, and try to consume natural foods as much as possible. I think that will help a lot to improve health, mental health and physical health.
Thank you, Hanno. If I may add just a quick comment before Karen talks. For example, in France, 15 years ago, it was not so easy to say, I'm a vegetarian and I'm going to bother everyone on the excavation because I don't eat meat. There was like a kind of cultural thing as well to say, oh, you're not eating bœuf bourguignon, that's not possible. I'm making a joke, but basically you have also the cultural aspect of food. You don't follow the group, you are an outsider. And I think it's something. Karen, please, and then Nicole.
Thank you. I'm actually going to walk backwards and say that I think in this case, we need to look at the food system rather than individual behaviors, even though I've been arguing for variation, because I think the food system becomes implicated in these diseases, and even last month, the Royal Society met in London to talk about obesity, and the comment that was made by a columnist for the New York Times was that not once in any of those discussions did the speakers blame individuals, that is, place individual blame on for these conditions of obesity and poor health. But this is where culture comes in, because in the United States, certainly, cultural values or ideals about responsibility, individual responsibility, body image, and so forth, are so very, very powerful. And the act of shaming is an example of this. But Julie Gutman and others have been arguing that instead of blaming individuals, we need to look at the food system, we need to look at the environment, the role of toxins, as you said, the ecology of food production, as well as the political systems that create access, but also regulate or don't regulate food production. So I'm going to argue that instead of focusing, I think we have to focus on individual diet in terms of our own health, but in terms of addressing issues on a wider scale, we need to look at the food system.
I totally agree. You're absolutely right.
Maybe something that I wanted to say in response to Hanno, but now it links to both of Hanno and Karen. Actually, I agree that we have to personalize. That's also what I said in my talk. But I agree also with Karen that there is a responsibility of the system. And one thing that we did not mention, but it is very, very powerful today, is the social media, the influence, especially regarding this body imaging problem. And one point I wanted to make, actually, it's a single observation, but probably it tells something about this story. It was shown that one of these diets, the gluten-free diet. Gluten-free diets is really important for who has celiac disease. So who has this disease must keep this diet, no way out. But it was also now a little bit a fashion to keep this diet for some reason. And it was shown by a study that it is bad for the microbiome. So we have to be careful with these fashion diets, because we don't know how we mess up with our health. So for medical reason, if we have to keep diets, this is okay. But for fashion reasons, we really have to be careful. And there, the social media definitely really play a role. And all these connections, they have to be studied and taken into account.
Remy.
Yes, thank you to give me the microphone, and thank you to all the speakers for wonderful talks. I'm not a specialist at all, but it happens to my mind one question, actually. Of course, the intelligence of the human being was very important in all the process. What about the demography? We all heard recently about the 8 billion people over the Earth planet, okay? How was it before? How was it with the Neanderthal, with the modern humans, etc.? Could we add this kind of parameter into the consideration of what happened, actually?
If I can reply to that, there is no way you could feed the number of people on Earth today with anything other than an industrialized food system. That there are too many of us to go back to anything like what our hunter-gatherer ancestors may have done, no matter what environment you're in. So food systems are not only about getting you to buy stuff, but they're also about feeding 8 billion people. And so you have to take the good with the bad.
Definitely.
Yeah. And that change in population side is also quite recent and was facilitated by the industrialization of our food systems as well.
Mm-hmm.
I see Luc and Francesco have a question, and then we have a comment in the chat maybe about lab-created meat. I don't know how to call this in the US, whether it's processed or non-processed food. I leave it up to you.
But like, okay, food system have to just to ask for clarification, Amanda. Food system, like we require a food system actually to feed 8 million. Yet we have population that are underfed, and we have other population that are absolutely wasteful in terms of resources. It seems a little bit contradictory, not only in terms of social, but also in terms of resources.
I don't mean to say that the system is equal in any way. I recognize that there are multiple problems within that system. I'm just saying that if you have the idea as a counterbalance to the paleo diet view, you really can't feed the same number of people on a non-agricultural, non-industrialized food source. You just can't produce enough calories per unit land to feed people, to feed as many people as are living today. So yes, it's not fair. Yes, it's not evenly distributed. Yes, there are inherent problems to it, and these are challenges for us to consider and to try to fix going forward that have multiple different solutions, industrial ones, cultural ones, social ones, whatever. But there's no going back, let's say.
Yeah, so I think redistribution will solve part of the problem, because that's what I believe you supposed, and I think I agree with that. But I also agree with Amanda that, as far as I understand from people who can, who have made this their profession, they always tell me there is no way we can feed the world a Paleolithic diet. That's definitely not possible. So we need agricultural technology. We need, there's lots of discussion about how do you say that? Cattle. So we need than we do now, but agriculture is the main source of our food provision, and it needs to be highly developed, because otherwise we won't manage.
Francesco had a question, maybe, or a comment. Your microphone, please.
Well, the first is not really a question, but is an observation. I think that the fourth talk, where I look at it from the perspective of our tipping point seminar, and I think that the fourth talk were perfectly complementary, with Hanno and Nicole presenting more the mechanism at work and try to give a long-term perspective, but mostly on the mechanism, while Amanda is more proposing a sort of long-term scenario. I would say long-term scenario that focus more on the biological aspect, while Karen is more focusing on the cultural aspect. So I'm very happy as one of the responsible of the tipping point seminar that in fact you have, I think, wonderfully covered the different aspects. And then to try to come back to our main endeavor, I think that the two presentations by Amanda and Karen were interesting, because in Karen, in my view, very appropriately point out the role of culture. The role of culture, one of the implications of the role of culture is that you may have a different innovation at different time, in different places, among different populations. So we are not probably only looking at the tipping point as a sort of major changes, but also different cultural trajectory by different populations. Modern human in Africa 100,000 years ago were probably not necessarily eating the same thing that modern human in the Near East, and the Neanderthal were not eating the same. So different environment with cultural innovation. I think we have to, a bit like in our situation at present with people eating nothing and the people eating too much, consider that we geographically and culturally, we don't have the same situation everywhere, and that innovation also spread in human history. So perhaps in this case, we should not only envision tipping point as dramatic changes in one trajectories, but different changes in different trajectories, because people, when they meet also, they not only transmit new cultural traits, among which also culinary or food type, etc., but also they innovate. So they borrow and they innovate. So the beer done in Germany is not the beer that is done by Zulu in Africa, and there are reasons for that. So perhaps we should envision a more complex scenario with a patchwork of different innovation and changes according to culture, in which perhaps in the first phases, biology is playing a major role, but after culture take over and is playing a more and more important role. So what I take back as a take-home message is that at the same time, it's very important that we know what are the mechanisms, but at the same time, we have to see how the mechanism has found their way in the history of our lineage. And in terms of food, I think is a very complex history.
Yeah, Hanno, please.
Just to add on this point, I think in talking about tipping points, we really aren't even beginning to talk about political and social institutions. And when you raise the issue of food access today, if we, scholars will already tell you that we produce enough food to feed 8 billion people, but it's access that is the issue. And access is impacted by politics. It's impacted by social institutions. It's impacted by social attitudes and so forth. So when we try to balance out the biological and the cultural, we need to also look at these other perspectives, I think.
Solange?
Oui, a comment on the comment. So finally, when we speak about inequalities and overdistribution and so on, maybe one of our evolutionary tipping point was the one when we started to become delayed return society. Because in fact, as soon as we start to store and to give a value to the food and to control the distribution of the food with a delay, in order to increase artificially the value. And I think it's a behavior that is not new, and it's really deeply rooted in our trajectory. And maybe this is the main shift, social and cultural and economical shift that we had in the past, that may explain the patterns that we have followed since.
Yeah, I follow you.
I was hoping to get to this really interesting question on lab-grown meat, but I don't have the answer for it. I wonder if either Hanno or Nicole is aware of this question and if it qualifies as processed foods.
Well, to be honest, no. It really depends on when is a food processed. There's a lot of discussion about that, as you probably know. As far as I'm concerned, if it has more than 4 ingredients, it's usually processed. And as far as I know, the meat from labs has just 1 ingredient, which is meat cells, which doesn't mean that but this is more an emotional judgment. I don't really like the idea, but I guess it's not processed in the sense that we call processed now, because it's as far as I know, it's just meat cells actually.
I would like to react on that because if we see this as a kind of solution to increase the availability of meat for better feeding people, I had read somewhere that basically eating lean meat, meaning meat without any fat, is not digestible, meaning that basically people that would feed on lean meat would basically starve. Fat is necessary to digest it. Is it no, Amanda?
Fat or carbs.
Okay.
I mean, there is a ceiling, there's a limit to how much protein you can have in your diet. And there's this rabbit starvation where you're eating only lean meat. But as long as you have either fat or carbs, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know if I may, but I think that already cooking or roasting meat is already processing meat because it totally changed the way in which we digest meat. So it's to put back the problem to a sort of very long-term modification of our environment. I mean, people have modified and processed food for very, very long, and this has clearly caused biological and cultural adaptation for a very long time.
Sure, You're absolutely right. So that's it's good that you mentioned this because I think the processing is not in terms of cooking or baking or roasting is not bad at all. It basically our gut system is built for that and it has adapted to it. But it's mainly that's why I call it constructing food. It's really the food industry actually constructs food, and that is really a bad thing. That turns out to be very bad for us. But the processing we do ourselves in our kitchen is fine. That's what we are made for, actually. Yeah.
If you make the distinction between industrialized food processing and processing that takes place in the kitchen,
right?
Settings, that I think is more helpful to that question.
Yeah.
Well, I think what is especially unhealthy in the processed food, in the case of meat, for example, these are the certain chemicals that are added, like nitrates and so on. They result as cancerogens and so on. So, and they are not there when you cook or whatever, if you ferment. So it depends really on what exactly you do. So it's just the word process per se doesn't tell much. You have to see what exactly you are doing to the food. But yeah, this the question about the lab-grown meat, I really share the impression by Hanno. I'm also, I cannot get used to this thought because it's not. Is it food? Is it meat? I don't know. Probably it is, but I'm not so friendly with it.
I've kept cell cultures alive in a cancer research lab in a previous life, basically, before I got into archaeology. And I mean, they're cells, they're alive. You have to feed them nutrients. You have to take care of them. You have to, I mean, it's like, I don't know if anybody's kept a yogurt culture alive, a sourdough culture, a kefir culture. It's a similar thing. You have to give it food. You have to take care of it every couple of days. I'm not against the idea of lab-grown meat. My concern with it, though, is it being, are the true costs of it actually being counted for? Because the nutrients that you have to feed them have to come from somewhere. Somebody has to be there to take care of it. How does it compare to other sort of cultures that we keep, like beer cultures, yeasts, this kind of industrial fermentation or changing of one substrate into something else? So it does remove maybe some of the ethical constraints of eating living things, but it comes with a whole host of other problems potentially as well.
And maybe it doesn't taste like natural meat as well.
I mean, the news piece I saw on it is that they were taking these cells and actually making breaded chicken cutlets out of them. So then they were not only taking these meat cells, but then turning them into our industrialized food construction things. So even if, you know, the base resource is perhaps ethically better, you're not necessarily solving the health problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
guys, I'm sorry, but I need to go.
Thank you very much, Hanno, for your participation, your talk, and the discussion.
It was my
really
pleasure.
delighted. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
I have to go as well. I'm sorry. I have to catch a train.
Okay.
Bye-bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Nicole.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you very much.
So I know it's 4:30, but if there are more questions or people want to continue talking a little bit, we can stay a little bit. We won't stay for 1 more hour, but the discussion is going well. So if you wish to continue, please feel free to. And now nobody wants to speak, of course.
I was thinking earlier on the discussion of the very first question about fad diets, people choosing diets for personal reasons. And one of the things I think is really interesting to consider is, when did personal and cultural preferences become the overwhelming driver of food choices? And that's actually really, really hard to answer in the archaeological record, especially early on. Yeah, that was your question. So anything sort of pre-agriculture, we assume that most of the differences are driven by environmental factors. What was available, you know, what was in that environment. And my view is that we should be testing for those as first explanations. And if that explanation doesn't work, then you can invoke a cultural or individual preference. Once you get, but where to say that first became important is I think an open question and still very hard to resolve.
Just to comment, in fact, there is one archaeological context, which is really, really useful to document food preferences of communities. They are the shell middens. Because in fact, shells, you have, I mean, basically you can eat all the shells. But you see similar biotope with similar shell diversity, and you will see that some population, like you know, the patella, the shell in form of hat, and one community they can gather the two different species of patella, and they will eat only one, and the other community, really far apart with absolutely no relation, they will choose the other one or the two. We don't know. And in a single region, in the Atlantic coast in France, for instance, you see, so all the shell species are the same from the Upper Pleistocene until now, more or less. And you see, and they were available all the time. And you see that some of the shell species were eaten during the Bronze Age, and currently we are not eating them anymore. And before that it was other species and so on. So we see, for the same availability in shell middens, like selection, like real selection of specific species, and it's explained by preferences, and not because of the collection techniques or anything, because you can gather them at low tide. It's easy and it has never changed. So we could have some little laboratory to observe the changes in preferences.
Yeah, I mean, those are interesting examples. I would say that they're a good explanation of what we would expect to see for cultural drivers of food choice. It's hard to find them further back in human history, unfortunately.
Cathy?
Yes. I'm not sure it was addressed, so I just want to ask this question maybe about the variety of food that we eat. When we look at wild plants that we can actually consume, we have like 200, maybe 400 of varieties of plant that we can eat. And when we compare to what we actually use in agriculture, it's a very narrow range of fruits, of plants. We always seem to eat the same, not only the same grains, for example, but also grains that are there's even in, for example, in wheat, the variety of wheats available is very, very narrow with the industrialization. So I was wondering if it was addressed, or maybe if it was also something that we could consider as a problem in our food consumption. And also, I have a second thought. I think it's Amanda. I think it was in your presentation. This it shows the difference of actually nutrients between a meat that is wild, a meat that is fed grass, and a meat that is grain fed. And we can see that maybe, so this is more about the density and the nutrients that are in our food that are lower if we industrialize more. Sorry for my English, it's very bad, but the more we industrialize, the poorest our alimentation becomes. So we have to eat more and more and more. But if we come back to maybe a more natural kind of food, maybe we could actually reduce the quantities and so feed all the people on Earth, you know? That was my...
To your first point, the variety of wild foods that are eaten. Yes, many, many more foods, plants are edible than we currently make use of regularly. But that's also true in every ethnographic study that I know of modern day foragers or hunter-gatherers or recent historical ones, where they could name and identify and talk about the edibility of a large number of plants. But then when you ask them, so what did you eat today, yesterday, last week, that number shrinks hugely. So they're still eating a very, or relying heavily, primarily on a very small range of that variability. I actually had a postdoc doing this kind of work with the Baka foragers in Cameroon. So yes, more is edible than what we regularly eat. Some of those choices are, even if it's edible, it's maybe not available, it's maybe not abundant, it maybe takes a lot of work to process, it maybe doesn't taste that great, maybe it's only used for specific times of the year or specific social events. Like, so there's also all of these other layers of food choices. To your second question, we don't know a lot about the nutritional quality of wild plants. What we do know is that wild plants vary way more than domesticated plants. We have reduced the variation, we've standardized the domesticated plants, but we've standardized them so that they have more calories, more starch, more sugar, more protein, more fat, so that they are actually a better bang for your buck, right? You're getting a denser package of nutrition than you do in any wild plant. By nutrition, I mean macronutrients, the things that you need to survive for energy. I think you might be talking about some of the problems with micronutrients that seem to be reduced in some of our modern domesticated crops, where yes, there are potentially some quite significant differences in vitamin C content, other micronutrients that are still important. But in terms of feeding people to sufficient calories to survive, you can't do that on wild foods. And actually, I also wanted to mention, it's a paper I have in review. I have a colleague who ate wild foods only, Northern European wild foods only for a month. And we collected his gut microbiome for the 2 weeks before, 4 weeks during, and 2 weeks after this experiment. And the consumption of wild foods alone causes a more drastic change in the gut microbiome than other studies where people adopted either a strict carnivorous or a strict vegetarian diet. So wild foods are really substantially different from our domesticated foods. But we can't say none of the changes in this microbiome were healthier. And I put big air quotes around that term because there's still a big debate about what is a healthy microbiome, etc. So his microbiome changed a lot, but it wasn't necessarily in the direction of a healthier microbiome. So yeah, there's an area of information that's lacking about the nutritional qualities of wild plants, and I'm really interested in that. But I still, and there may be opportunities to incorporate more wild plants in our diet. And that was something a lot of people did during the pandemic, which was really fascinating to read news articles about. But it's not necessarily a sustainable solution to feeding 8 billion people either.
Yeah, if I may, there is also some food that we don't consider it. Well, some people do start to think about it, about insects,
yeah.
Because they are very high in proteins, and also algae. They are very interesting, and they are very used in Japan, where in Japan there's much less obesity than in the rest of the world, right? Because also I think they also eat a lot of very fresh food, not so much processed food as we do, which might explain also. Another thing too is I saw this information about in our processed food, not only is the salt and the sugar and the fat and all that in excess compared to other natural, well, things that we would prepare ourselves, but also there is an increase in the separation of molecules. You don't take the protein, only the protein of the starch, or you take only the separation of the molecules in the food, which seems to be complicated for our body to process too. I don't think, I'm not sure you understand what I mean.
I didn't hear you. Your sound fuzzed out right when you were talking.
Okay.
So you say.
Yes, because there's a tendency in the industrialized food to actually put molecules that are not entire, that are cotton, that are separated, like you use the protein of the starch, or you use the lactose of, you know what I mean? So
right. So removing food components from their original context and putting them in other foods. Yeah. I'm sad to say I know less about that, and both Hanno and Nicole, who might be able to say more, are no longer here.
Okay. If I may also, I have another question that pops into my mind. It's about the water consumption. I'm not sure we have spoke about this, but there might be something with the quality of the water, the way we drink. I'm not sure. I don't know. It's just a question or something that pops into my mind.
Not something I've really looked much into. I'd be hesitant to speculate.
Yeah, because we usually when we think about food, we don't think about the water consumption, but it's also important for our body. I mean, it's what we need more after breathing. So
I think it comes back a bit to what Nicole and Hanno were saying about processed food when they showed the pictures of sodas and things like that. Basically, we need to drink a certain amount, and basically water is a basic drink we should be drinking, the basic beverage. And in our Western societies, some people replace it by processed drinks, and that increase the intake in sugar and in additives, and that may be also a kind of bad habit that basically water and more basic beverage such as milk should come back more like natural drinks, I would say natural drinks. Alexandra?
Yeah, hi. Amanda, I was thinking of your paper that you published with Adam Van Kasteren.
Oh, yeah.
On the energetics of chewing. And well, as you know, like there have been a lot of literature about the link between like changes in diet and the morphology of the face. And as someone who's interested in that question, I was wondering just what you think about this. I guess, yeah, it's a very complex question, but
right. So Alexander is referring to a study where we tried to measure the energetic costs of chewing itself, and also comparing between two different gums that had two different mechanical properties. So one was much harder or tougher, excuse me, one which was much tougher than the other one. We saw that, somewhat to our surprise, chewing is actually quite energetically costly. And so our explanations for changes in the skull, like I explained for the robust Australopiths that have this huge chewing muscles and giant teeth, that actually makes sense as a way of saving energy. So you spend a lot of energy in development to grow all of this, because if you can spend less time and effort actually in chewing, if you're chewing a lot of very tough stuff, the overall energetic costs will be lower. So people have invoked that explanation without actually having measured the cost of chewing beforehand. And we showed that, in fact, there's not only a cost to chewing, but it varies significantly between the two types of gums, between the softer food and the tougher. The mechanical properties of if you're eating really tough leaves, for example, will make a big difference in the amount of energy that you're spending. So an animal that eats tough foods will have greater energy savings by developing a more efficient masticatory system. The difference between what we measured and our sort of evolutionary explanations is that humans don't chew very long in present day, that our food has been domesticated and processed and cooked, and it's soft, and it's actually pretty easy to break down in our mouths. So you have to think about this as being an impact much earlier in our evolutionary history, where we were eating very tough, raw, unprocessed materials. Does that answer your question, Alexandra?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other question or comment? I would have a kind of awkward question for Karen. I come back to what you said about attributing a value to food. And I have several ideas in my mind, like the trade of spices, offering for gods and things like that. So it's maybe a silly question, but when did we start using food not for feeding, but for offering or for something else than feeding? And what do you think were the primary food item we would afford to waste for not feeding? Like, it's a really tough question, I know, but I just would like to think about it with you all.
Okay, well, a couple of thoughts. One is that food storage gives us potentially an excess, but what happens with food storage is that so much of what is stored is lost to insects, to weather, lack of preservation, and so forth. So in most contexts, food storage doesn't necessarily free you to be, I don't want to say wasteful, but I think that's what I'm saying, less concerned about preserving your foods. And I don't know if you're familiar with William Rathje's study of garbology, which I think goes back to the 70s, and the interviews they did, I want to say Arizona, contrasted what people said they threw out between what they actually threw out, and it was pretty appalling, the differences. When do we get to feeling like we can be less concerned about protecting our food sources? And I think I would come back to this concept of complex societies. The earliest textual evidence for cuisine, or what Jean Vautreau called court cuisine, comes from Mesopotamia, from these culinary tablets, and he describes these tablets and notes that they're very different from if you were to try and prepare these foods, and some people have done this with good results and not so good results. But if you were to compare those dishes based on those lists of items with the evidence of food waste from a more typical domestic setting, you would see tremendous contrast in what people are able to consume and what is available and what they have access to. So again, with Mesopotamia, you look at the rise of temples and priestly class, as well as bureaucrats who are controlling access to stored food resources, for example. There was a really interesting experimental project a number of years ago now about what are called bevel-rimmed bowls, BRBs. This dish, this ceramic dish in a standardized size that is found at many sites across what was ancient Mesopotamia. What was their function? And the theories have been, well, it was for grain distribution, your ration for working, or you to the temple are redistributed and then given back as a ration. And so I think there's plenty of evidence from Mesopotamia that shows that we are transitioning from food storage as a matter of survival, perhaps, to societies where not only can certain people be food producers and others can do other things, but there's enough assembling of resources and control of access and distribution that you can see the divergence in food ways based on evolving social and religious classes. So I would look back at least that far. I'm not sure what you would find for evidence before that. I think the storage, food storage from before those times tends to show, again, size, spoilage, the reasons for spoilage, and so forth, but it doesn't necessarily equate to having extra with which to experiment. But you can tie in fermentation and the production of beer and wine on a large scale. I think that's really, that's a good tipping point, what you've mentioned there, Evan.
Are there any other question or comment? I would have a last one if no one else has, but priority to the others. No, then my little question about fermentation. You spoke about it quite a bit with beer and bread, and I'm wondering how this happened. Basically, do you think it's like it's my ignorance about the literature, certainly, but is it like an opportunistic discovery for, I don't know, during certain condition of storage where they basically saw that the food went bad and they tried it because, I don't know, they were starving or something, and then they thought, oh, it's not so bad and maybe it's easier to digest or something?
Yeah, I think
naive approach.
I think we have to absolutely think about innovation as the result of happenstance, you know, and it's based on observation, but also experimentation. You know, you go ahead, you try it, and if it doesn't sit well with you, then I won't consume it. But Yeah, opportunistic discoveries that berries, for example, or grains that are harvested, even if they're not domesticated, but just cultivated or husbanded, can potentially show someone that changes are happening and experimentation can result. But you can also observe what happens to birds who are consuming berries, for example, that are overly ripe and they don't behave normally, right? So again, your question is why would this happen? So maybe I'll try it out. So yeah, I think there's absolutely an element of opportunism there.
Any other comment or reaction? No? Then I think we can conclude and thank again all the 4 speakers that gave really wonderful talk and for these very rich discussions, very nice questions and comments. I think it was one of our most lively seminars, so I'm really happy about it. Francesco, do you want to add anything? With your microphone, please.
Well, basically, I already said that I'm, as you, very happy with the presentation, and I found that it's really fully complementary, and they have stimulated even colleagues who are working on field that are very, very different from food. So I think we have achieved what we had to achieve, which is looking at tipping point from a broader perspective. Thank you very much, all of you, for attending the meeting. And we are thinking about something a bit more alcoholic, as you know, tipping point in the production of alcoholic beverages. And we will be in touch about that. It's very, of course, Bordeaux is the right place where to organize a tipping point on that issue.